Oh, good. Okay, so hello. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm going to try to sort of give a high-level introduction to deep learning. It's a technique that's been talked about a lot, hasn't been applied a lot to brain imaging just yet, although there are a lot of things in progress. What I'll do is give kind of a brief introduction and history of deep learning, and then I'll talk about some of the models that fall under the category of deep learning, and try to give an example of those models applied to brain imaging data for each of those. And then in the end, I'll give a list of some of the tools that are out there to do deep learning. So the fundamental sort of unit for deep learning models is a neural network, artificial neural network. And just as a reminder, you essentially have, you have data that goes in, and then you have those multiplied by a set of weights. And then they're summed together, and then there's some sort of a nonlinear function that's applied to the result. Either a rectified function like this, or if you use a logistic function, it's actually very similar. A single layer like this is very similar to logistic regression. And then what you're doing in deep learning is you're basically taking these and you're stacking them side by side and on top of one another. So here we have a single layer in the middle here, and then we have two layers, et cetera. So it's a stacked model with multiple nonlinear transformations, essentially. So why do we care? In the press, you've probably seen deep learning has made had a lot of recent successes. It beat this depressed Go player here. A company called DeepMind implemented it in AlphaGo. It can be used to play video games, and not just simple games, like this with basic rules, but also games where you're interacting and responding to lots of different scenarios. And it can also do things like simple things like, well, we have a picture like this, and we want to learn the styles of these figures and apply that style to this figure, and so you can kind of do that sort of a transformation as well. In terms of the brief history, the fundamentals have been around a long time. So we had basically the perceptron or sort of neural networks have been around since the mid-1900s. Then you had a period of great excitement and then a period of great depression. It's kind of like funding or submitting papers. And then multi-layered perceptron came about in the 1990s, followed by support vector machines. But there was still some struggling in terms of are they really going to be able to beat existing methods. And then in the 2000s came about the deep neural network with some major improvements, one of them being pre-training, how to train the network, and other kinds of advanced approaches for learning these complex models. And that was primarily by Jeff Hinton's group. Probably one of the biggest breakthroughs that happened recently was in 2012. And so at this image classification competition at ILSVRC, Jeff Hinton's group submitted a network called AlexNet, which was a deep network. It took about 5 days to train on many, many different images with labeled labels associated with them. And their performance, their error rate was 16%, but it basically beat the pants off of the second best competitor, which was 26%. And so this really woke up the community to, hey, these models can really actually outperform existing models. And they also used, in order to train these models in a reasonable amount of time, GPU units. So here you can see they were first used during that submission. Since then, GPU use has gone way up, and performance has continued to improve. And these are all deep learning models that have continued to outperform. Some of the key landmarks, you actually had, so AlexNet itself was a 7-layer model. But people are going crazy now, and you've got here GoogleNet, which is 22 layers, ResNet in 2016, 56 layers, and they actually tried a 1,200-layer model. It didn't do as well, probably was overfitting. 56-layer did quite well, though. It's only a few parameters there, right? And so you can see this is getting really complex, and it has gone outside of typical computer science applications to medical applications, to retinography, classification of skin cancer, genetics, et cetera. Currently, there are about as best I can tell, about 40 papers or so on in different applications to brain imaging data. So that's growing rapidly now as well. And one other point, these layers can sometimes be useful in and of themselves on top of just, say, a classification or something like that. You've probably seen this in the context of other kinds of models where you have, say at the top layer you might have concepts like faces. In a layer down you might have features like components of faces, and then these are the fundamental elements. And so this doesn't always happen. This is a very restricted case, but there can be some useful information in those middle layers as well. This is just a picture of, not even complete, of some of the many different kinds of deep models that are out there. Every one of them has a different name, a different purpose, a different goal. And it's become really kind of an engineering challenge. You've got all these different pieces. You've got to put them together, figure out how to optimize, figure out how to train it, et cetera. And I'll go through a number of these models one by one. Some of the key just advances are lots of data available, standards. So the competitions, for example, you have a benchmark that you can show improvement against. Computation with GPU, and a lot of different techniques for doing better learning. In terms of training, I mentioned pre-training, dropout is another one. Optimization tools, the ability to do differentiation without numerical errors propagating. And so those are just a few. So now let me just start with kind of one of the more basic models called the restricted Boltzmann machine. This is not a deep network. This is a building block for deep networks. But essentially you have neurons like this, and they're restricted in that there's no connections within a layer, just between the layers. And essentially the goal here is to optimize a function here which contains a term called the Gibbs energy, which is a combination of the weights. And so it's an unsupervised approach. You're just trying to optimize that function. Okay, that's a restricted Boltzmann machine. When you apply that approach to fMRI, say resting fMRI data, for example, you can show that it actually gets out brain networks that are typically found with ICA, independent component analysis. ICA is actually implemented particular algorithms like Infomax ICA is a single layer neural network. So it's a neural network model, just one layer, and it's linear. And so it can perform comparably to ICA. You can also see that down here in the simulated case. This is the ground truth. Here's the RBM. Here's the ICA solution. Okay. A deep belief network is essentially a stack of RBMs. So you basically start stacking them on top of one another. Here's an example where we have 5 stacked. And you can decide how many layers you want to use. So how do we train this? Now we've got all these parameters. Well, one way to do this, at least the initial approach, is called pre-training, where essentially you train one layer at a time. So you fix all the layers and you just train the first layer with the data. And you tune it based on what your objective is, classification in this case. Then what you do is you take the output from that fit layer and you feed that output into the second layer, and you fix the weights on the first layer. So now you're just adjusting weights on the second layer. Do the same thing, and you can do this for arbitrarily many layers. So it basically initializes your model, and then you fine-tune it later. And this approach is what they used for that AlexNet approach that did so well. So does this help with, is it just a golden hammer? Does it work with everything, or will it work with brain imaging? That is still being looked at, but the initial results are looking fairly promising. This is structural MRI data. Essentially, it was segmented into gray matter maps, so voxel-wise maps, and then fed into a deep belief network. And if you look at the bottom here, we're basically looking at a comparison of the raw data, 1 layer, 2 layers, and 3 layers. And we have both training and testing data that are actually getting more separated as we go up as we add more layers, which suggests that this actually might be useful. Another example here from a more complex case, not just, say, patients and controls, we have multiple groups here. We start with 1 depth where everybody's overlapping. Depth 2, we get a little bit of aggregation. In depth 3, we're starting to see a little more structure here. We have schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, schizoaffective, healthy controls, and the relatives, et cetera. Again, it looks promising as a tool here for separating the groups. But that's not the only goal that we could have. This is a similar gray matter data set from a Huntington study. So we have 3,500 MRI scans. And we've basically separated the controls from the patients, and we're representing it in this 2D plot. And then if we go back and we color code for disease severity, which the model knew nothing about, you can see this nice gradient here where the least severe are on this side and the most severe are on this side. So again, that's promising because it learned that feature from the data, and it's an interesting one, without knowing anything about it. So there's no opportunity for bias here because it didn't even know what those were. So again, an interesting example. So now if we look at more generically, so to just multiple neural networks or a deep neural network, or similarly a multi-layer perceptron, which you've seen before, we can actually use that kind of technique to implement an ICA approach that's nonlinear. So here we have basically a transformation that M includes basically a nonlinear or a stacked multi-layer perceptron. And as a just sort of sanity check, we simulated some brain networks with a nonlinear transformation as well as a linear transformation. And when we look at the ground truth here, here's two different fake networks. The linear ICA approach kind of gets in the ballpark but doesn't do particularly well, whereas the nonlinear ICA does much better. Okay, but is this something that's actually merited? Do we really think this is going to be useful in the brain? If we look at, again, data here from real brain data, we can actually implement this approach and we can get out networks that look fairly standard, but then we can ask the question, is there any nonlinear information in those extracted networks? And in some cases, like here in basal ganglia, we see it's fairly flat. We don't see much evidence of nonlinearity, whereas in this one, in the visual cortex, you can see that there actually is some nonlinear effect there, and it's significant. Again, the linear effect is the largest effect, and it remains to be seen how much information we can extract from this. But again, it suggests the utility of looking at nonlinearities. A question that folks often ask about deep learning is how do you train it with limited amounts of data? We're getting more and more data these days, but it's not infinite. And so one way that's done quite a bit is to do something called data aggregation, where you essentially simulate realistic realizations from a data set that you have access to. So you estimate from that data, and then you generate other data from it, and you use that again to train your model, or at least get it close to where it needs to be. And if you do that, it substantially improves your performance by, in this particular example, by about 10 or more percent in terms of our performance. And this is just an example of one of the outputs that showed group discriminative regions. Okay, the third area that I wanted to touch on is called an autoencoder. So there's all these cool names people give their models, and you have no idea what it means. But autoencoders are essentially a model for sort of representing data. Essentially, it's trying to do data reduction and reduce your data and fit your data quite well with a smaller number of parameters. And it does it with this kind of in and out type model, where you have the full data going in here, and then you're reducing it down to a smaller number of nodes, and then this one here in the middle is the code that in the end is supposed to be representative or fit well to your data. And then you reverse that process to the output so that it can look at how well it's represented to your data. You can represent those. And to give you an example of how it's used, representing handwritten digits. Here we have a set of individual images, each one of a handwritten digit. And if we train an autoencoder, before it's trained, it doesn't look very good. But once it gets up to about the 9th epoch here, you start to see these numbers coming out are looking a lot like they're looking like numbers, and they're kind of representing all of the different numbers. And there's a variation on that, variational autoencoders. Essentially, it just adds a probabilistic element to the code. So for example, you might encode in a simple case the mean and the standard deviation and assume there's a Gaussian variation around that code. So it gives it a little more flexibility and a little more robustness. And everybody wants to create pictures of cats. So, and one example of using an autoencoder from fMRI data, this is resting fMRI data. Essentially, the input was connectivity patterns, and this is from Jay Lee's group in Korea. And so they basically designed an autoencoder to represent the patient and the control functional connectivity patterns. And so they're basically using a stacked autoencoder, and you can have the same model where you have nodes and they're getting reduced down to a smaller set. And I mentioned before about the different layers. In this result, you basically get a hierarchy of connectivity patterns that are coming out. This is the highest layer here, which gives a very robust set of significant differences between the schizophrenia and the patient control, schizophrenia and healthy controls. In addition, in terms of classification, the deep neural network did significantly better than either a linear or a nonlinear support vector machine. So convolutional neural networks, these are essentially a slight twist where what you're doing is you want to capture neighborhood information, either in a 2D or a 3D image. Through a kernel, basically. And so these little squares, so they're sliding around, convolving with the data, capturing the neighborhood information. And sometimes there's a pooling step where you reduce down to the size of that filter, and you keep going through that process until the end. You have just predictions based on the categories that you are interested in this case, dog, cat, boat, or bird. A combination of CNNs and autoencoders can be created, a convolutional autoencoder, where you're essentially taking two CNNs and flipping them. So this is a convolutional neural network with a deconvolutional neural network after that. And the benefit of that is you also get a representative image at the output here, which tells you more information potentially about the features. And I would argue this kind of thing is going to be important with brain imaging data. We don't want to treat these models as black boxes, I would argue. We want to actually dig into the parameters. We want to understand how does this map back into a brain region or into a subject, et cetera. We don't want to stop at the high level. And you can use a convolutional neural network to do, for example, segmentation, where what you're trying to predict, in this case, we're not pooling, we're staying at the same dimensionality, and we're trying to predict voxels, whether they belong to, in this simple case, non-brain, gray matter, or white matter. We can train this on imperfect samples. So we can take, for example, a free surfer segmentation, which is a reasonable solution but isn't perfect. It has some errors in it. And we can train the model, and then we can go back to the original data or to other data and create our segmentation. And in some cases, it'll fill in some of the errors that we had. This kind of represents also the important point. One of the important things about deep learning that can be used is we're not doing any initial processing on the data. We're taking the input image as it came off the scanner, and the model basically learned how to segment those images. So without any of these other pre-processing steps, this is sort of end-to-end segmentation. Recurrent neural networks, another variation, instead of looking at spatial neighbors, you're looking at temporal neighbors. You're trying to look at sequences. These kinds of models are used a lot for language, natural language processing, for example. So you have a time index here, and you're kind of keeping track, and there's a memory associated with your model. Lots of variations on these. You can do shallow RNNs, deep RNNs. You can do bidirectional, so you've got future and past, et cetera. And this kind of model can be used for fMRI data, where you might be interested in capturing some of the time-varying connectivity that's ongoing. And so you have basically a temporal model, and you can look at deviations from that, say, in the spatial map. So here we have two networks extracted from REST fMRI data, and I'm showing examples of those networks as manifesting at different time points within the data. And we can also look at the connectivity between networks as a function of time. So again, it gives us a way to capture both spatial and temporal changes over time in the data. And then the last example that, is just sort of a hybrid. In this case, the example I use is data fusion. So we have two models, an attention model, where we have a figure with a caption and it's trained, and so if you highlight a word in the caption, the model tells you where in the figure it thinks that word is present. So frisbee highlights this, girl highlights the girl's face. And then we have an alignment model, which is a recurrent neural network, right? So here it's used sometimes for translation, where you have one word that might map into multiple words, or the order of the words might be different, okay? And if we, so why would this kind of combination be useful for brain imaging? Well, if we want to combine structural data, which is static, with functional data, which is dynamic, we might take as input, for example, features from the structural data, covarying patterns of gray matter extracted with an ICA model on the structural data, and functional features that come out of a dynamic connectivity fMRI model. So we have basically time-varying connectivity matrices clustered down into states of connectivity, and then for any given subject we have a vector that tells us at what point in time they were in which state. So we have time on the right, we have static space on the left, and we can combine those in a model essentially here, which has both a sequence predictor and an attention network. And just the one quick result from that is that it's learning alignment of structure to function, association in any sense, nonlinear or linear. And we find, for example, that state 2, which I'm not showing on this slide, sorry about that, state 2 is significantly aligned with this bilateral insula gray matter region. And in addition, the schizophrenia patients are showing a much stronger, significantly more alignment between that structure and function relationship than are the healthy controls. So it gives us a way to ask questions about these links between structure and function that we know are present in the data, and we don't fully understand how they work. And then this is just a slide to kind of give an example. There's tons of tools out there to do this. Theano, Torch, TensorFlow, or some Python-based approaches, Caffe. MATLAB actually has a substantial number of deep learning tools that they've added to their tools. Cortex is a Python library that we've developed for brain imaging. It's still in development, so it's sort of a work in progress. And then here's just a list at this link of a lot of different tools beyond this. There's tons more on the slide. And also, I've just covered a few models. There's many more out there, the newer ones. One of them, for example, is the generative adversarial networks, which are performing quite well, generative models. There are lots of new training approaches. I mean, if you follow this community at all, or you start following it, you'll see things are changing all the time. Everybody's excited, and there's a lot of things happening there. So by the time you give a talk, it's out of date. And this is just a standard slide for some of the software tools we develop. Only one that's deep learning is the Cortex one here, but the tools for sort of generating features as input, if that's the strategy that you want to use, are here as well for group ICA, for data fusion, et cetera. And I always have to show a slide of my lab because they've done a lot of the work that you see in the slides. And with that, I will stop, and I guess we might have time for a question or two. Yeah? Okay.
Very nice talk and very nice summary about the deep learning on the function MRI. And because a lot of deep learning approach is originally implemented in the static image, so there's not much. There's some, but there's still not much research about deep learning application in the functional MRI. I know there's some, but there's very small sample size, and the problem they are solving is relatively not generalized enough. So I'm just wondering, what's your thought on the?
I think they're coming. I think it's just a matter of time. As I mentioned, there's only about there's only about 40 papers out there in total in MRI, and that includes fMRI, structural MRI, every modality. So yeah, I know there's a number of groups working on sort of sequence-based methods. I agree that there hasn't been a lot that's come out yet, but I think it's just a matter of seeing what comes out over the next couple of years.
And just a brief follow-up. Yeah. So what is your thought on overcome this small sample size problem, especially that's become more severe in the functional MRI?
Yeah, no, I think you've got to be mindful of that. As I mentioned, I mean, I wouldn't start with a small sample if it were me. I would try to try to test the model out on a large sample. There's a lot of those available today. But what is large, right? Is it 100? Is it 1,000?
Yeah.
Is it 10,000? I think you have to have a pretty good sense of how robust your model is, and these techniques I mentioned, like the generative data generation, can really help with smaller sample sizes. Things like that are working on voxels, if you incorporate the spatial information, those can be a little bit more robust because, for example, the segmentation approach can be trained on just a few data sets because it has all the voxels to learn these patterns. So perhaps a combination of incorporating the spatial information, which we have more about, and in these different training solutions might help. But yeah, I'd be careful though.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks for the nice overview.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I guess, in my experience, the concern with these models or the secret sauce to get this working is hyperparameter tuning and regularization type of stuff. So what are your comments on hyperparameter tuning and the variability of the model architecture over different cross-validation techniques? Because you show a lot of brain maps and functional networks. How do you measure the stability over different folds?
Yeah, I mean, we usually look at stability by looking basically at batch level processing. So we do subsets to see if we're, at least within the data that we have at hand, is it stable, right? Because if it varies all over the place, then I wouldn't trust it in that case. I think the sort of secret sauce still applies a little bit, but I think there are continual improvements in training strategies. Things like dropout can help, where basically what you're doing is for a certain probability, you're dropping out individual weights, right, to see how much that impacts your network. You still have to pick that probability, of course. So there's a hyperparameter there to worry about, but it's not a ton of those. So yeah, I mean, I'm optimistic, but I don't mean to say that that you can just apply these out of the box, because you typically do have to, for a particular problem, you typically have to design a network that can solve that problem, and if you apply it to a different problem, it may not work well. There are some promising results in the area of transfer learning, where people are training in one set and then modifying it and seeing how well their models can transfer. So I think there's hope there for that. But I wouldn't necessarily think that has to be the case if you design for a particular problem like the segmentation problem. It works pretty well on any MRI image that you give it, but it won't work on fMRI. So it wasn't designed for that. So.
Thank you.
Uh-huh.
Thanks for a very stimulating talk. You actually touched upon a problem that I'm seeing, and this is that I'm trying to interpret what does the deep network do, which, a certain layer, a certain node. And what I want to ask is, are there any tools or approaches to try and understand that?
Yeah. There are tools out there, but I think as we transition to brain imaging, we need more. Because again, the comment I made earlier about, you don't want to stay in this abstract space. You want to always go back. That's hard work, right? And we've also got layers. We've got all these parameters, and I think ways to visualize those, ways to map those back to, something that's meaningful biologically from the brain. I think that's a big area that needs to grow. As people start to apply these more and more to the brain. So I completely agree with you that unless you're solving something like, I just want to predict A versus B, and I can do well at that, and that solves a problem you have, it doesn't tell you anything about the brain, right? It just tells you that you can predict that thing. So I think that's a very important area.
Can you mention briefly existing tools?
The Python tools I met there, and actually even the MATLAB tools, they do give you the ability to visualize the different layers. They can do relevance propagation is one technique, which basically takes the layer and pulls it back up and then provides a picture. So I can actually get a voxel-wise representation of what that layer is, is what kind of information that layer is capturing. So you can then at least map it back to a particular brain region. So that's a technique, and it's implemented in a number of those tools.
Thank you.
Thanks for the talk.
Sure.
So I trained some deep models, and I've had a lot of trouble recreating some of the recent papers because the field is going deeper and deeper and deeper.
Yeah. And faster and faster and faster, yeah.
But in 3 dimensions, my graphics card is just not big enough. And the transfer learning that you were talking about, all the most famous models are trained on Google images of 200 by 200
right.
voxels. So do you think we're going to get huge upgrades in hardware, or are we going to have to try to develop some of our own strategies for neuroimaging that are different?
I think the hardware is still evolving. I mean, you can batch it up across multiple cards. That's one strategy. But you'd need a multi-GPU system to do that, or GPU cluster to do that. The cloud-based services now have large, computational capacity, both CPU and GPU. So that's one that can be potentially accessible. You need to be able to, you have to pay them to use it, but it's not outrageous. I think hardware will continue to evolve, and I think also sort of clever strategies for pulling your data into pieces that can be processed on existing hardware will continue to work. I mean, we trained the segmentation model, which is a 3D convolution model as well, on a system. It was a multi-GPU system, but it wasn't that expensive. It was about 3 or 4 cards, I think, is all we had in there. So,
All right, thanks.
great. Thanks again.